What if the system you trust to protect you is the very one that betrays you? What if the laws meant to ensure fairness and equality are compromised by biases so deep that they determine the very fate of your life? This is the reality for countless people, especially when race intersects with justice. Is justice really blind? Or does it see color first? Today, we're going to explore a story that challenges the core of our belief in an impartial legal system. A case that highlights the flaws in the system that were meant to protect us all. In this instance, a young black teen found himself facing an overwhelmingly unfair sentence, sentenced by a white judge in a courtroom where race, rather than evidence, seemed to weigh most heavily. This wasn't just a verdict handed down in a vacuum. It was a decision that sent shockwaves through an entire community. The case revolves around a black teenager whose future was altered by a judge whose biases and prejudices seemed to cloud the entire trial. His crime, the punishment, and the shocking decision made by a white judge reveal not only how racial inequality manifests in the courtroom, but also the devastating effects this injustice has on families and communities. At the center of this story is a teen whose life will never be the same after a court ruling that many would argue was predetermined from the start. On the opposite side, we have a judge whose decisions and actions reflect broader societal problems, the racial biases that remain embedded within the judicial system. And of course, the families, whose lives are torn apart as they watch their loved ones suffer the consequences of a broken system. This case has become a symbol of systemic injustice, a rallying point for those who believe that change is long overdue in the way our justice system operates. But why does this matter? Why should we care about this specific case? The answer is simple. It's not just about one teen's fate. It's about how this case shines a light on the glaring racial disparities in our courts. It's about how a single trial can expose the devastating consequences of a justice system that fails to protect those most in need. This is a story that forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about race, bias, and justice in America. As we delve deeper into this case, we'll examine the details of the trial and the trial's aftermath, exposing the forces at play. What went wrong in this courtroom? What do we need to understand about the role of race in the judicial system? And how did a seemingly ordinary trial unfold into a tragic story of systemic failure? This is not just a story about one judge, one teen, or one case. It's about an ongoing issue, the reality of racial bias in the courtroom that affects real lives every day. Stay with us as we explore the shocking story of how a white judge sentenced a black teen unfairly, setting off a chain of events that would forever change lives. In the heart of this case lies a disturbing truth: the racial disparities within the judicial system that have long plagued the United States. For decades, the courts have been accused of treating black defendants differently, a phenomenon that continues to affect the lives of thousands, even millions, of black individuals. This case is not an anomaly. It is a glaring example of a much larger systemic issue, an issue that threatens to undo the very ideals of justice. For the young black teen at the center of this trial, the circumstances leading to his conviction were already marred by a set of conditions that most people will never have to face. From the very beginning, race played a pivotal role in his case, an unfortunate reality that many black Americans know all too well. The teen, raised in a neighborhood rife with poverty, was accused of a crime that many felt was magnified because of where he came from. The nature of the crime, a robbery allegedly involving stolen goods, was relatively minor, but in the eyes of the court, it took on a different weight. The teen had been at the wrong place at the wrong time, surrounded by people who had their own legal histories. However, in the eyes of the prosecution, the crime he was accused of was compounded by his race. The young black teen was immediately seen as guilty in the court of public opinion, where racial prejudices clouded the issue from the start. Racial stereotypes played a significant role in the prosecution of this case. The court, influenced by these harmful biases, viewed the teen as part of a criminal class, a dangerous stereotype that disproportionately affects young black men. According to the National Center for State Courts, black individuals are overrepresented in the U.S. criminal justice system, with black people accounting for approximately 40% of all incarcerated individuals despite making up just 13% of the U.S. population. This disturbing fact highlights how deeply ingrained racial bias is within our courts, where a black defendant is more likely to receive harsher sentencing, even when the crime does not warrant it. For the teen, the psychological weight of facing a biased trial was immense. He knew that his race would factor heavily into the decision made by the judge. Even with his defense team presenting solid evidence of his innocence and a lack of intent, the teen couldn't shake the feeling that he was already being judged, not for his actions, but for the color of his skin. That thought alone, knowing that systemic bias would likely determine his fate, added a layer of emotional turmoil to an already difficult trial. How could he stand a chance when the very institution meant to uphold fairness and justice seemed bent on finding him guilty? But the teen's feelings of hopelessness were not isolated to him alone. His family, too, was deeply affected by the racialized nature of the trial. His mother, already a pillar of strength in the community, now found herself grappling with the painful truth that her son's fate might be decided not on the merits of his case, but by prejudices rooted in centuries of racial discrimination. "I raised him to be better than this system," she said, her voice shaking with frustration and grief. She, like so many others in the Black community, has spent her life witnessing the harsh realities of racial injustice. To her, this was just another chapter in a long history of Black lives being systematically mistreated by the legal system. In the community, the trial became a point of deep contention. Supporters of the teen rallied, voicing their concerns that this case exemplified a wider issue of racial bias in the judicial system. Activists worked tirelessly to bring attention to the case, organizing protests and calling for justice reform. One such activist, Jamal Carter, a leader within the local civil rights organization, stated, "This isn't just about one boy. This is about every Black person who has been wronged by this system. We're watching this trial, but we've been watching this injustice for centuries." The emotional toll of this situation wasn't just felt in the courtroom. It rippled through the community, igniting anger, confusion, and an overwhelming sense of helplessness. How many more young Black men would face similar fates, trapped in a system that sees them as guilty before they even set foot in court? The stakes were higher than the teen's fate alone. This case had the potential to highlight the rot in the system, a system where Black individuals are not only punished more severely but also punished for things they didn't even do. The tension surrounding the case only grew as the teen's sentencing approached. His family felt the weight of every passing day, knowing that the ruling could destroy their lives forever. The teen's mother, in particular, was consumed with a deep sense of dread as she thought about the long-term consequences of an unjust conviction. "I just want my son to have a future," she said, tears streaming down her face as she spoke with reporters. Is that too much to ask? The case's aftermath would leave a scar on the community, one that would take years to heal. No one could erase the unfairness of the trial, and no one could erase the deep-rooted racial inequalities that shaped it. But what had really gone wrong? How did this happen? Why did a white judge, whose responsibility was to be impartial, make a decision that would impact a Black teen's life so severely? Was it his bias that led to the harsh sentence, or was the entire system, his biases included, just inherently flawed? The truth was that the judge's decision was not an isolated event. It was part of a larger pattern of racial disparity in sentencing, which continues to disproportionately affect Black individuals in the U.S. justice system. Statistics show that Black defendants are far more likely to be sentenced to longer prison terms than their white counterparts for similar crimes. This fact alone raises an important question. Why does race continue to play such a significant role in the courtrooms of America? As we uncover the core issue, we begin to realize that this case is not simply a moment of injustice for one teenager. It's a reflection of a much larger societal problem that has existed for centuries. Racial bias continues to distort the concept of justice in ways that are not always visible but are devastating nonetheless. The day after the sentencing, the air in the courtroom was thick with a heavy sense of injustice. The teen's family, community members, and activists who had been observing the trial knew something had gone terribly wrong. Their instincts were not wrong. This trial, this decision, was not just about one mistake or one biased judge. It was about a system that was fundamentally broken, one that refused to protect the rights of those who needed it most. It became clear that the teen's case was just the tip of the iceberg. A ripple of concern quickly turned into a tidal wave. A small group of local activists, already accustomed to fighting racial injustice in their city, took immediate action. They were no strangers to such cases, but this one hit closer to home. It was personal. The teen's family had been involved in the community for years. His mother, in particular, was well known for her work with local youth programs. The pain she felt was felt deeply by the entire neighborhood, and it was this shared grief and anger that became the foundation for an organized fight for justice. The first step in the investigation was to dissect the trial itself. Activists and lawyers who had been closely watching the proceedings immediately began to ask questions. They wanted to know why a judge, who was supposed to be impartial, had made such an extreme decision. Was this really a case of justice gone wrong, or was it something more? Was the judge's personal bias at play? Lawyers began poring over the case files. They examined the trial transcript line by line, looking for inconsistencies or red flags that could point to bias or misconduct. What they uncovered sent shockwaves through the community. Several aspects of the trial seemed deliberately overlooked, or worse, manipulated. The teen's defense attorney had not been given sufficient time to present key evidence, and several crucial witnesses had not been called to testify, testimonies that could have altered the entire course of the case. But more troubling was the role of the judge. The defense team had a hunch, but they needed hard evidence. An investigative reporter from a local news station, eager to uncover the truth, took a deep dive into the judge's past. What they uncovered was a pattern that couldn't be ignored. The judge, a white man with a long history on the bench, had presided over several cases that involved black defendants. In almost every one, the sentences were disproportionately harsh. In some instances, the sentences appeared to be out of line with similar cases involving white defendants. It wasn't just that the judge handed down severe sentences. It was that, in many cases, he seemed to overlook exonerating evidence or extenuating circumstances. What started as a hunch now had hard facts to back it up. This judge was known for his inability to view black defendants with the same level of fairness as white ones. His record, once scrutinized, made it clear that he had a troubling history with racial bias. But this revelation didn't come without resistance. The local judicial system tried to suppress the story, using every legal loophole to prevent the media from publishing its findings. They attempted to dismiss the claims of racial bias, arguing that the judge's decisions were based on the facts presented in each individual case. However, the mounting public outrage could no longer be ignored. It became clear that there was something deeper at play, a much larger, more insidious problem within the legal system. The media caught on, and soon, the case was making national headlines. Activists from across the country joined the fight, amplifying the message that this was not just one case of racial bias. It was a symptom of a much larger epidemic. The national conversation shifted to racial inequality in the justice system, sparking protests, social media campaigns, and a growing movement for judicial reform. #JusticeFor Teen's name trended worldwide as millions of people rallied behind the teen's family. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that this case had not just been unfair, it had been rigged. Hidden evidence, intentionally ignored by the prosecution and the judge, began to surface. A key witness who had been too scared to speak out during the trial came forward, revealing that the teen had not been involved in the crime at all. In fact, the teen had been the one who tried to stop the robbery, a fact that had been deliberately downplayed during the trial. The new evidence cast doubt on the entire premise of the prosecution's case and exposed just how much the teen's fate had been sealed by factors other than the truth. Meanwhile, the teen's family, who had been battling despair and helplessness since the day of the verdict, began to find new hope. They had never stopped believing in their son's innocence, but now they saw the cracks in the system, cracks that could lead to a breakthrough. It was an emotional roller coaster. Moments of elation as new revelations came to light, followed by crushing setbacks as the defense team fought to have the case reopened. The pressure mounted on the family. Every phone call from their lawyer brought with it a mix of anticipation and dread. They felt the weight of the entire community on their shoulders, knowing that this case had the potential to change the way people viewed the justice system, or it could be just another forgotten tragedy. Tension soared as the defense team took their findings to the appellate court. They argued that the original verdict had been reached under the influence of racial bias and that the new evidence, combined with the judge's troubling history, warranted a retrial. The court system, known for its slow pace and reluctance to revisit cases, hesitated at first. But the public outcry was too much to ignore. The voices of thousands who demanded justice for the teen could not be silenced. The teen's case became a touchstone for the larger movement to hold the judicial system accountable for its racial biases. Just when it seemed like the case might slip through the cracks again, a game-changing moment occurred. An anonymous whistleblower from within the courthouse came forward, providing evidence that the judge had been warned about his own racial bias years ago but had ignored those warnings. This revelation hit like a thunderclap. This wasn't just about one judge's actions, but about an institutional failure to confront racial bias at its roots. Suddenly, the national spotlight was focused on the judge's entire career, and the case took on a new dimension. It wasn't just about the teen's innocence anymore. It was about the need for systemic change within the entire legal system. As new revelations flooded the media, the teen's family found themselves at the center of an emotional storm. Their lives, which had been turned upside down by this unjust sentence, now became the face of a national movement for racial justice. Despite the immense pressure, they remained resolute in their fight. Their son's future was still uncertain, but they knew they had to continue the fight, not just for him, but for every Black person who had been wronged by the justice system. In the midst of the mounting tension, the teen's defense team made a dramatic discovery. The judge had previously been involved in a controversial case that had never been fully investigated. The case, one in which a Black man had been sentenced to life in prison for a crime he didn't commit, had been marred by glaring inconsistencies. The same defense attorney who had worked on that case was now fighting for the teen, and they were starting to connect the dots between these past injustices and the current case. The discovery of this link sent shockwaves through the legal community, leading to renewed calls for the judge's impeachment. The momentum was building, and the public was no longer willing to sit idly by while another miscarriage of justice played out in front of their eyes. The investigation into racial bias in the teen's trial had gone from a local concern to a nationwide movement, forcing the legal system to confront the uncomfortable truth about its deeply embedded prejudices. The discovery of the judge's troubling history and the mounting pressure from the community had placed the case front and center in the public consciousness. The teen's family, exhausted and grieving, now saw a glimmer of hope that they had not dared to believe in just weeks earlier. The first major turning point came when an influential legal organization, known for its work in fighting racial injustice, joined the fight. This group of seasoned lawyers, activists, and social justice leaders immediately recognized the potential of the case to create real, systemic change. With their involvement, the teen's legal team gained a powerful ally, someone who had the resources and expertise to challenge the decision at the highest levels. Together, they prepared for the most critical moment of their journey, a public appeal for a new trial. But they would not just present the facts of the case. They would present the entire argument for racial equality in the judicial system. The teen's family, having spent days in shock and disbelief, now turned their focus to advocacy. The pain they had carried so privately for so long was now shared with thousands, maybe even millions, of others who had faced similar injustices. His mother, once quiet and reserved, became a powerful spokesperson for the cause. Every interview, every rally, every public statement she made was a call for justice, not just for her son, but for every Black person who had been unfairly treated by the system. The family, though emotionally drained, began to find new strength in their struggle. As the case grew in prominence, the pressure on the judicial system intensified. What had begun as a conversation within the local community had now become a battle cry for reform. The public outcry was impossible to ignore. Major media outlets picked up the story, and public figures, including prominent civil rights leaders, athletes, and politicians, began to speak out. Their voices resonated across social media platforms, turning the hashtag #JusticeForTeens name into a powerful symbol of resistance. Then, just as it seemed that the case might stall in the appellate court, an unexpected development took place. The judge, who had presided over the initial trial, was called in for questioning. The public scrutiny, combined with the damning evidence of racial bias, had finally led to a formal investigation into his conduct. A growing body of evidence pointed to the fact that the judge had allowed his personal prejudices to cloud his judgment in not only this case but also several previous ones. The weight of public opinion and legal analysis finally pushed the system to hold him accountable. The judge, once an untouchable figure, now found himself facing the very same kind of scrutiny he had never extended to the lives of black defendants. At the same time, the teens' legal team had secured a new avenue for justice. The case was officially reopened, and the teen was granted a new trial. This was not just a victory in the courtroom. It was a victory for the entire community. It was a turning point in the fight for racial equality, a moment where the system was forced to acknowledge its failures. But as the legal team began preparing for the new trial, they also recognized the long road ahead. While reopening the case was a significant step, the teens' innocence had yet to be fully proven in a new court of law. They were far from a final victory, but for the first time, there was real hope. The teens' family, at this point, had experienced an emotional transformation. What began as a sense of hopelessness and defeat had shifted into cautious optimism. His mother, especially, now carried the weight of not just her son's fight, but the fight of an entire generation of black individuals whose lives had been torn apart by the justice system. Her words, once filled with pain and doubt, were now filled with fierce determination. She made countless public appearances, sharing her son's story and urging people to join the fight for justice. Her transformation mirrored the transformation of the community itself, once fragmented and disillusioned, now united under a common cause. The legal battle was only part of the broader transformation occurring in the justice system. The public outcry, combined with the widespread media coverage, had placed unprecedented pressure on lawmakers and legal authorities to take action. As the teens' case continued to make headlines, the conversation around racial inequality in the courts expanded. This case became a rallying point, one that exposed the deep-seated racial bias that pervaded the entire system. Conversations that had once been confined to academic circles, civil rights groups, and marginalized communities were now in the mainstream, challenging every corner of society to confront its role in perpetuating systemic racism. And it was not just the teens' case that was impacted by this shift. Across the country, other cases began to receive renewed attention. Legal scholars, journalists, and activists began to investigate past convictions that had similar racial dynamics. They uncovered case after case where black defendants had been unfairly treated by the justice system, often due to biased judges, prosecutors, and law enforcement. These discoveries fueled the growing movement for judicial reform, which began to gain traction at the state and national levels. Politicians, many of whom had previously been reluctant to address issues of racial bias within the justice system, now found themselves forced to act. Legislators proposed new bills aimed at addressing racial disparities in sentencing, increasing accountability for judges, and improving the transparency of the judicial process. The teens' case, once a tragic injustice, had sparked a revolution in the way the country viewed its justice system. It was no longer just about one teen's unfair sentence. It was about ensuring that no one else would face the same fate. As the case moved forward in court, the teens' family found themselves at the forefront of a movement for change. They were no longer just witnesses to injustice. They had become the faces of a fight that was far larger than they had ever anticipated. Their pain and grief had been transformed into a powerful force for good, one that would be felt for generations to come. Finally, the day of the new trial arrived. The teen, now supported by an army of legal professionals, activists, and allies, stood before the court once more. The evidence, both new and old, was laid out before the judge. It was clear that the original conviction had been tainted by racial bias, and the defense team had successfully proven the teen's innocence. The judge, who had been forced into retirement due to the public outcry, was no longer a figure of authority in the courtroom. In the end, the teen's conviction was overturned. The weight of the systemic flaws in the judicial system could not be ignored any longer. It was a monumental moment of triumph, not just for the teen and his family, but for every person who had fought tirelessly for justice. But while the victory was sweet, it was also bittersweet. The journey had been long, painful, and fraught with setbacks. Yet, in the end, it was proof that change was possible, that the tide could turn even when the odds seemed insurmountable. As the years passed since the teen's case was finally resolved, the ripple effects of their fight for justice continued to reverberate. What began as a deeply personal battle against racial injustice had evolved into a historic turning point in the broader movement for equality within the legal system. The The teen's case, once a symbol of defeat and despair, became a beacon of hope, a proof that change was not only possible but essential. And for the teen, now a young adult, the journey had been transformative in ways they could not have anticipated when they first stepped into the courtroom. When the teen was finally released from the unjust sentence and their name was cleared, they faced a complex reality. The emotional and psychological scars of the trial would never fully disappear. No victory could erase the trauma they had endured. The isolation, the prejudice, and the intense pressure of facing a legal system that had already decided their fate long before the trial began. But the teen's case did something even more important. It gave them the space to heal, to rebuild, and to channel their experience into something far larger than themselves. Their future, which had once seemed uncertain and dim, was now full of potential. The teen, once an anonymous face in the crowd, became a symbol of resilience for those fighting against systemic injustice. They began speaking at rallies, giving interviews, and using their story to raise awareness about racial inequality within the legal system. They pursued a career in law, determined to one day become a part of the very system that had failed them, this time, to ensure that others would never have to endure the same fate. Their future was no longer defined by the trial, but by the movement it sparked. This young person, who had once been labeled a criminal, was now a voice for the voiceless, advocating for the rights of marginalized individuals who had been wrongfully convicted due to racial biases. The teen's case and the subsequent fight for justice ignited a broader societal shift in how people viewed the justice system. No longer could the public ignore the racial disparities that plagued it. Conversations that had once been relegated to activists, legal scholars, and marginalized communities were now taking place at the dinner tables, in classrooms, and in legislative chambers. People began to question the very foundations of the judicial system. Was it truly fair? Could it be trusted to treat everyone equally? As a direct result of the teen's case, several significant reforms began to take shape. At the local level, the district attorney's office was forced to reassess their approach to cases involving racial minorities. New oversight committees were established to ensure greater accountability and transparency in how cases were handled. Prosecutors and judges were trained in cultural competency and anti-bias strategies to better understand the complex ways race influenced decision-making. Nationally, the conversation about racial bias in the judicial system gained momentum. Several states introduced legislative reforms that addressed racial profiling, mandatory minimum sentencing, and disparities in sentencing. More importantly, the focus shifted from mere acknowledgement of racial inequality to the creation of actionable solutions that aimed to repair the damage done. Though the process was slow and fraught with resistance, the teen's case had undeniably shifted the cultural and political landscape. Public attitudes also evolved. As the legal battles raged on, more people began to see the teen's fight as a microcosm of the larger struggles faced by Black individuals in the justice system. Protesters took to the streets, demanding change not only for the teen, but for every person who had been unjustly affected by systemic racism. Public opinion polls showed a growing support for judicial reforms and a greater willingness to address racial disparities head-on. The movement that began with one teen's story became a catalyst for a much larger transformation in public attitudes toward race and justice. The emotional journey of the teen's family was nothing short of extraordinary. At the outset, they were devastated, caught in the suffocating grip of fear, uncertainty, and grief. They had never imagined they would face such a nightmare, but once it had begun, they had no choice but to endure. As the trial progressed, their emotional toll was immense. The family watched helplessly as the legal system, which should have been a place of protection and fairness, became an instrument of their loved one's oppression. But as the fight for justice gained traction, the family began to see a transformation within themselves. The pain they had carried for so long became a source of strength. No longer merely the victims of a biased system, they became fighters, advocates, and symbols of resilience. The mother, in particular, became a tireless advocate for racial justice, speaking at rallies, organizing protests, and meeting with lawmakers. She was driven by the belief that no other mother should have to endure the same pain she had experienced. Through this emotional journey, the family found solidarity within their community and beyond. The support from activists, legal experts, and fellow families who had experienced similar pain helped them to heal and find hope. The teens' fight for justice became not just their fight but a collective cause that brought together people from all walks of life. The emotional transformation of the family was marked by an unwavering commitment to the cause, even as they continued to navigate the pain of what they had lost. Yet, even with the case's resolution, the family understood that their work was far from done. The fight for justice did not end with the overturning of the conviction. It was only the beginning of a much larger battle to ensure that no one else would suffer as they had. For them, the journey had been one of profound transformation, from grief to resilience, from helplessness to empowerment. They had become, in the truest sense, catalysts for change. Though the teens' case was a victory, it was a bittersweet one. The emotional toll of the trial and the loss it had caused would never fully be healed. The process of seeking justice, of fighting against an entrenched system of racial bias, had left scars on the teen, their family, and the community at large. But there was also a sense of pride and accomplishment. This was not just a fight for one teen. It was a fight for the soul of a nation. And as long as systemic racial injustice remained, the fight would continue. The teens' case had exposed the cracks in the judicial system. It had illuminated the pervasive and harmful effects of racial bias. And it had shown that, when communities come together, when individuals refuse to accept the status quo, real change is possible. But the work was far from finished. This case had sparked a wider movement for racial equality and justice. It had shown the world that no injustice is too small to fight against, and no system is too big to be challenged. The legacy of the teens' fight for justice would live on in the reforms it inspired, the conversations it sparked, and the hearts it touched. As we reflect on this case, we are reminded of the words of those who fought for justice long before this case came to the forefront. The struggle is ongoing, but it is worth it. There is no room for complacency in the fight for fairness, equity, and racial justice. It is a fight that requires action, reflection, and a commitment to making the world a better, more just place for all people. As the teen and their family continue to heal, they do so with the knowledge that they are part of something much larger than themselves. They have sparked a movement that will continue to grow, and that movement will continue to push for a world where racial bias is no longer tolerated, where the legal system is truly blind to race, and where justice is served for all, regardless of the color of their skin. The story is not over. It is just beginning. And as long as we fight together, as long as we continue to demand accountability, change will come.